I'm Scott Davis. I'm the founder and executive director of Medium Photo. Pleased to welcome you all virtually and in person to our talk with Michelle Dunn Marsh this afternoon. Huzzah! I want to begin by acknowledging that we are broadcasting live from San Diego, California. This is the unceded land of the Kumeyaay people who continue to live here today, and I want to express our gratitude for their sharing this land with us. I'm about to turn the stage over to Michelle Dunn Marsh, and at first when we were planning this year's edition, somebody said, "Oh, it's so great to have a lecture by a non-photographer." And I thought, yeah, that is amazing. And why didn't we do this before? And then I realized we actually have done it several times before, just not often. And I think it's a ripe topic, especially for somebody such as Michelle, who has spent a considerable portion of her adult life in photography, working with some renowned figures, and as a publisher, helping promote the work of so many photographers in a way that's analogous to what we do here at Medium, but totally different because they make books that last forever and we have lectures that last for an hour. That said, I'm honored to have Michelle here today and proud to welcome her and all of you. Thank you.
Thanks, buddy. Do I just, oh wow, magic. I just start talking and I'm mic'd up. Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here. Thank you to Medium, to Scott and Joey and Liliana, to the sponsors, to the board. I have a long history in nonprofit organizations, so I understand the importance of thanking the board. And also to all of you, because if there were not attendees, if there were not reviewers who are taking time to be here, we wouldn't have the conversations we've been having. So it takes a village for all of us to come together. And I very much appreciate that while you could be sitting by the pool, you have chosen to be here. I will try and go quickly, and then we can all go to the pool. Scott said, my name is Michelle Dunn Marsh. I want to acknowledge for a moment that one of our authors, Nicholas Galanin, it is his book, Never Forget, that is down here at the bottom of the stage. For those of you who can see it, Nicholas has an opening tonight in New York at Peter Bloom Gallery, so sending our good wishes to him. And I have started carrying this book and presenting it whenever I present publicly because, of course, all of the land that we are on in many parts of the world, but certainly speaking of the United States, is Indian land. And so the opportunity to acknowledge that is one that is important to me. I am so glad to be here holding space as a professional viewer of photography. I have spent much of my career apologizing for not being a photographer, and I've decided after 30 years I don't have to apologize anymore. You all need fans. Those of you who make, you need those of us who just want to see. And I am one of those people. Minor White said that the viewer completes a photographic image, and finding that quote was really important to me because I felt like, okay, I know what my job is, I know the space that I can hold, and that we are indeed necessary to one another and to the photographs themselves. So this talk is drawn from my book, Seeing Being Seen, A Personal History of Photography, which is informed by my personal and professional life and the privilege I've had to work in this field. Why am I calling it a personal history? Well, I have seen that it is common for compilations and books to be put together without necessarily an acknowledgement of the perspective of the author's viewpoint and the subjectivities that we inherently bring to what we are researching, to what we are studying, to how we bring them together. And so I wanted to acknowledge that this is a history of photography. I don't think there is the history of photography. The history of our medium is short, and is ever evolving. And I love that about photography, that I don't have to learn 5,000 years of something. I've got less than 200 to contend with. And so the opportunity to share both a history that came before me, the history that I have been able to live and be a part of, the students that I hope will continue to form our histories. But I wanted to acknowledge that this is coming from my experiences and my viewpoint, and so the photographers that I have chosen to include in the book and the subsection of that I've chosen to share here are really coming from my views in photography. This is a little snapshot here of my professional life. Graphic design continues to be an important part of how I function in the world. So the top half of this, which I've shown over many years, is just a sort of quick snapshot geographically and professionally. I grew up south of Seattle. I went to Bard College. I don't know why Pace University didn't make it up there, but I did do a degree at Pace University. So these are places where I held actual W-2s. These places are all the places that I was simultaneously getting paid while I was also doing those things. So as we're moving along, and is the case in the book, there's sometimes some movements back and forth through time. Because I've done a lot of things simultaneously, those of us who love photography understand time travel. And so I don't think that it will be challenging for you to follow that. This is a way easier way for me to look at what I've done with my time. The top shelf are all publications that I have worked on. I began as a designer at the Aperture Foundation with, we'll talk about that in a moment. But books have always been an important part of my life. I wanted to make books from when I was 3 or 4 years old. I didn't realize actually that books could be made from pictures forever, not just when you were a child. You could just keep looking at picture books your whole life. And that was an amazing and really wonderful discovery. I am going to start with a little bit about my background and the people who put me on the planet. So we have here my grandparents on my mother's side. I only met one of my grandparents. This is kind of what happens with diaspora existence. So this is my grandmother, my Nana, Theodora Christensen. She was born in Rangoon. My grandfather, Walter Vallis, was born in Andhra Pradesh in India, in what is now India. That is my paternal grandfather, Thomas Gabriel Dunn. Very little known about him, but this photograph was made in Glendale, and in my fantasy life, Edward Weston took it. My grandmother, Anastasia Patricia Walsh, that's my father in the middle, my beautiful mother standing next to my dad. My parents met in Seattle at a Catholic mixer in 1966. When they met, it was still legal in 13 states of the United States for people of different races to marry. My mother was born in Burma. Her family fled to India when the Japanese bombed Mandalay, where they were living at the time. She was in India for 7 years, then her family went back to Burma. She eventually worked at the US Embassy and came to the United States in 1963 after the military coup in Burma. So she has had a very complicated life, and then she met my dad, and for a brief period of time, lived happily ever after. I grew up in a beautiful town called Puyallup, Washington. I feel very grateful that I had the opportunity to grow up in a place where our indigenous peoples are on their ancestral land. We always knew when we were crossing into another nation, and that was just a wonderful thing to have in our area. This is a view of Mount Rainier from Puyallup when there were still daffodil fields. The photograph on the other side is one of my first major occurrences where I questioned sight. And that was in 1980 with the eruption of Mount St. Helens. I did not grow up where we lived. You can't see Mount St. Helens from Puyallup, but we could see the ash cloud. And so as a child, to suddenly have something appear in the sky that had never been there, if someone had said, you didn't see that, You just imagined it. It doesn't actually exist. I would have believed them. I would have preferred that. And the second time in my life that I had a similar experience of witnessing something that I didn't want to be real was standing on Fifth Avenue in 2001 when the first tower came down. And so the notion of sight and memory and our relationship to what is real has kind of always been present. I am the youngest of three. My brother and sister are both adopted. And so we had a wonderful experience as children because people would sometimes comment on how much we all looked alike. And we agreed with them because we do, as you'll see shortly. And other people would comment on how different we looked, and we would also agree with them. And so again, this kind of notion of the malleability of what we see has really been present from my beginnings. This photograph is one of my favorites. This was the day of my first communion. My father, in his deep spirituality, he was a very spiritual person. I don't know why he gave me a baseball glove for my first communion. But I rarely got new things as the youngest, so I am treasuring that I got my own brand new baseball glove with some friends of my mother's standing nearby. And then a friend from high school recently found this picture of us, and you can see me in the red baseball cap, looking very serious and a little terrified because I was really bad at sports in a very sports-focused environment. This is the last photograph of my family of origin together. My father died of cancer when I was 14, which was about a month after this photograph was taken. So this is a picture that's really important to me, that just sort of holds, again, a moment in time and the ways in which photography became accessible to me as an art form because I understood the importance of photography as documentation, as witness, as object. And so it felt like a very easy path from treasuring family photographs to treasuring works of art. Oh, we're still not getting it. This is Dad. There is another picture of here in the book. Close your eyes and imagine. It's me in my father's tux. So you'll get to just look at him for a minute while I talk a little bit about the period of time that really brought me into the making of books was working on yearbooks. And I started typesetting in junior high school. So that was, we had computers, but they were sort of glorified typewriters is what we were using them for. So it was my first introduction to being in a darkroom and printing images and laying things out with waxed sheets. And it was very visceral. There were a lot of like razor blades and chemicals, and I loved it. I thought it was fantastic. And I didn't have language for what that was, right? I had written, I understood writing and books went together, but this other thing didn't have words for it. Nobody ever said, this could become a job one day. It was just something that I really enjoyed doing. And so when I landed at Bard College, which is about an hour and a half north of New York City in the beautiful Hudson Valley, I had never visited Bard. They sent me a lookbook that I know now that Len Gentschel and Frank Ockenfeld's The Third shot. I blame my entire life on those two men. They took photographs of people sitting under trees reading books. And I thought, oh, this is college? I want to do that. I want to sit under trees and just read books. And so off I went to Bard, having never visited, knowing nothing about it. And I'm very lucky. I had an incredible education. I was studying literature, but then fought my way into an internship in the publications office. And this cover of an issue of the Alumni magazine at the time was a really important catalyst for me. I had gone out to get bagels and coffee because that is what good interns do. And when I returned, the art director and the director of publications and the designer were discussing whether the word Annandale, which was the title of the Alumni magazine, should be brighter than, the same tonality, or slightly darker than the tones of the William Wegman photograph. And they spent about 45 minutes discussing this. And again, I was totally riveted. I'm like, I don't know what this is, but I want to have these conversations. And also, side note, William Wegman had nothing to do with Bard. At all. The head of the publications office, Ginger Shore, married to Stephen Shore. Ginger loved photography. She was married to a photographer, and she took every opportunity to champion the medium. And that was such an important lesson that at the time I was certainly not conscious of, but as I look back on it now, I see she was putting Wynne Bullock photographs to illustrate science articles. I mean, she just didn't care and said, I'm gonna put these images in front of people. And so I had this wonderful exposure because of these great women. This slide came back to me about 4 years ago. Don Hammerman, who was commissioned to photograph for the college, I said, you know, I look at these pictures and they don't really look like what we do as students. Why don't you show more what we do? And Ginger said, well, go out with him for the day and you'll learn about what it means to be a professional photographer and you can guide them on who you think they should photograph. So this is a completely set up shot in my dorm room as I'm laying out all the books that I wanted them to highlight, and there's a Starbucks coffee bag in the back of it, and it's just a little snapshot of kind of moments of what defines our sense of identity at a particular moment in time. I completely forgot about this, and then Dawn found me on Facebook and said, I found this slide, if you would like it. I was like, okay, I don't know if I need to be reminded of my slightly cheesy taste. I still had a stuffed animal my junior year of college in my dorm room. I became so enamored with the work that was happening in the publications office that I wanted to study graphic design. And that was not a field of study in a liberal arts environment. And after talking to a few different colleges and exploring different options, I found this sort of odd program that was a choose your own adventure, find a graduate school that will accept you if you're studying something you can't study at Bard, and if they agree to take you in without an undergraduate degree, you can complete a bachelor's and a master's in that master program, provided everyone agrees. This was a paragraph like this big in the college catalog that I was typesetting, which is how I discovered it. As it turns out, no one had ever done this program. And another person was trying to do it and was sort of intimating that the college was false advertising on behalf of the college because no one had ever done it. So I got approval like that. And I started writing letters as a sophomore in college, asking graduate programs if they would accept me without an undergraduate degree. And not surprisingly, almost all of them said no. But two of them said, you can apply. You have to go through all of the same. One needed a GRE, another had essays. So I got into NYU's Gallatin division and a master's in publishing at Pace University. I ended up attending the program at Pace. And so this is actually right after I had left Bard for a year, gone to New York City, done my first year of graduate work, and then came back to walk with the rest of my class. And this is kind of a funny photograph. It's an RC print. Ginger sent it to me. I didn't remember that Stephen took it until many years later when I had a better sense of how important Stephen Shore was. And I just shoved it in a manila folder and was like, oh. So I pulled it out and showed him when he came to Seattle in 2004. And he said, oh yeah, I took that. Do you want me to sign it? And I said, no. If you sign it, I have to take care of it. And he laughed and signed it. And then this funny thing happened in the book because I still didn't really think of him thinking of it as a Stephen Shore photograph. There are other images of his in the book, and I ran this across the gutter, which is across 2 pages for those of you who are perhaps less familiar with book design, thinking like, well, this isn't a real Stephen Shore, so it doesn't really matter if I cut it in half. And he wrote me a very nice note back and said, the layout of the postcards looks great, please don't split the other image. And I was like, oh, he takes this seriously. Okay, I won't. And And it was amazing, actually, that I saw the architecture of the image, particularly, this sort of space of what's happening up here. I saw it in a completely different way once I looked at it as a photograph, instead of as the moment that I was graduating from college. And so it's, again, that reminder of those points of familiarity and what we see, and then perhaps what we miss. So in my first semester of my first class in graduate school, I met a man named Steve Barron. And Steve was the head of production at Aperture. He had done an internship with Minor White in 1963 in Rochester for the Rochester people in the house, and had continued to be involved with Aperture in some form ever since. And I was the nerdy kid at the front of the room, again, looking for connections. New York City was a big place for a girl who grew up in a farm town. And so I walked up to him after the first class and said, "Wow, you work at Aperture. Do you know Stephen Shore?" "I know Stephen Shore." And he was like, "Yes, I do, and so do thousands of other people." That was my beginning with Steve. At the end of the class that I took with him, I asked him so many questions that he said, "Okay, I'm gonna make you a deal. I'm taking you out to lunch. Have a list of all of your questions. I will answer as many as I can, and then respectfully, I hope to never hear from you again." And so we went to lunch at the Morgan Library, and I realized that I needed more than the advisor who worked with all of the students on their thesis. I needed more than that for what I wanted to do. And so I was like, great, I'm gonna ask Steve to be my advisor. Missing completely what this poor man was trying to politely say to me. And so we go to lunch and we sit down and he kind of sighs and I say, "I only have one question." He's like, "I don't believe you." And I said, No, it's only one." He's like, "All right." I said, "Will you be my thesis advisor and work with me for the next year?" And he just literally put his head in his hands. He did advise my thesis. I would send him whatever I had written before he went on press checks, because typically when he printed books for Aperture, he would be traveling for a couple of weeks at a time and had odd hours and long plane trips. And his notes, I still have all of his notes from working on my thesis. And his notes are sometimes longer than the chapter that I had written, questioning what I was thinking about and who else I needed to talk to and different ways of exploring the subject matter. And he went on to hire me at Aperture in 1996. He was my introduction to Minor White, and really such an important figure that while I worked as a designer at Aperture, I was also really simultaneously training in book reproduction with Steve. And that was something at Aperture that was so important, that we were reproducing art. And at a period of time where people may not see the image any other way than in the publication that was being created, right? There were not nearly as many galleries as there are now. Museums didn't have the same kind of collections that they do now, even though that's recent history, right? Even though that's 25, 30 years ago, it has still grown exponentially. And so this is a prime example of a print that would not have passed Steve's muster. This is a Barbara Morgan print from 1946, and it is cracked, it is yellowed, and I absolutely loved it. It was the first print I bought, and I had the opportunity to buy it because a colleague said, "I have these two prints that someone wants to sell for $150, and I looked at it and there was something about the fact that it was damaged that really spoke to me. This was something that would not be considered valuable. It would not have worth. It would not certainly be good enough for reproduction. And yet it was here, and it had lived, and it was in the studio, if not made by the photographer. And I had learned enough at that point to understand the difference between a vintage print and a and something made from a copy stand. And so being able to live with a print by one of the founders of Aperture was such a powerful thing. And that was something that Michael Hoffman, who was the director of Aperture at the time, he wanted people to live with photographs. I mean, a large part of the limited edition program that started in 1973 and continues to today was finding ways to allow people to live with photographs. And so while we made very little money, we were sometimes given prints as a thank you or could trade prints for work. And so it was an opportunity for people who might not otherwise ever be able to afford to buy a print to actually live with an original photograph. And that was a really powerful and transformative thing. This was also a period of time where we were, again, really in flux in terms of technology. So I was hired at Aperture because they had finally purchased a Macintosh computer. And my colleague Leslie Martin, who is here, who was there slightly before me and then again after me. I mean, again, it's hard to remember, right? But then when we launched the first website in 1997, we had to digitize over 40 years worth of covers of books. We had to type in descriptions because none of that was electronic. And so things that are so easy to us now or seem so simple, one of the readers for my book was really like, Michelle, do you really have to write about how you measured the top and the bottom and the left and the right of every print to a 64th of an inch and then calculated? I'm like, yes, it is important because we don't have to do that anymore, right? That is a time and a task and a meditation that technology has changed. And so remembering back to some of those tasks that seemed arduous, but were also kind of wonderful because you spent time with these objects. And that was really, for me, I continue to come back to that tactile nature of being able to hold things that are infused with meaning and with value. In 2000, 2001, I had the great privilege of designing a book catalog for Carrie Mae Weems. This was a project called the Hampton Project, which is not what you're looking at. But it was the first time that I met Carrie. It was the first time I worked with a photographer whose work I already knew. And so that was a significant moment of, I wasn't sort of, okay, this project comes in, now I need to learn about this person. This was like, I know who this person is. This is Carrie Mae Weems. And that was a very powerful moment. Also because when I met Carrie, Carrie noticed that I was not 100% Caucasian. And that had never happened in quite the direct manner that it did in that moment. And it was so jarring for me that I didn't even know what to say. So I no, I can't, what, yeah, I don't know. I see the signals, I see the code, and I'm turning away from the code. And I had the chance to talk to her about that 20 years later. And I was so surprised that she remembered. I said, I feel like I need to share with you how profound that moment was, and I didn't handle it very well. And she smiled and she said, I know. As Carrie does, for any of you who know her. And the fact that I've been able to continue to know her and work with her occasionally over the years has been so important to me in finding language to describe myself and my identity and allow it to be complicated. So 2001 was a major marker point for many people in many ways, in many parts of life. I had moved back to Seattle for 30 days and wanted to buy the house that I grew up in. Wasn't sure that New York City was the place to be, loved my job, loved my little studio apartment, which took forever to get, loved my boyfriend, and yet home was not New York, home was Puyallup. Wasn't sure where I fit, where I belonged, and so I went back to Seattle for 30 days. Michael Hoffman called and said, we need you, and I said, I'll be on a plane. And went back to New York, which started 20 years, really, of a bicoastal existence. And while I was in New York for the summertime in 2001, Michael got very sick in August of 2001, We all know what happened in September of 2001. He died in November of 2001. And that was a huge marker point and change in my life. I had gotten married, and this was the beginning of the next phase. That working as a designer, working behind the scenes, being a collaborator, but not having to be out in front of the world, was no longer the roles that I could fulfill. And it felt, Scott and I were just talking about this briefly, but it felt in the early 2000s there was a kind of desperation around the survival of photography, the survival of the medium. What will happen? This thing called digital has arrived. And it was a huge shift. And on top of that, things internally at Aperture, there was a lot of change. And so I was brought on to run a West Coast outreach program that was specifically tied to our Aperture's 50th anniversary and placing its exhibitions along the West Coast. Aperture, for those of you who don't know, started on the West Coast. And so invigorating those relationships was something that was important to the board and important to the institution. And so I had a one-page mandate and was literally like sent off into the wilderness. And it was a good thing that I was raised Catholic and understood about preaching the word, and I was ready to go. And so I started just meeting with people in Los Angeles and San Francisco, listening to them, and we eventually set up a lecture series and a number of other programs. This, in some ways, is a transitional image for me because William Christenberry, so we ran this lecture series where we would bring photographers to the West Coast to speak in Los Angeles, San Francisco, and Seattle in a 5-day period. And the organizations that we partnered with were part of selecting the artists that we featured. And so when William Christenberry came out, he projected this image in Los Angeles, and I just started to weep. I'd seen this photograph many times, but at this scale, it became the barn that I grew up with. Sorry, guys, I will stop hitting my chest. It became the barn that I grew up with. It became a place that I lost. And I realized that if I could own this photograph, I wouldn't lose my barn. I would always have it. I would always have something that I thought I lost. And I don't remember telling Bill that. I really don't. But Photo Alliance then released this like a year and a half later as a limited edition print. And so I felt like the photo gods were smiling on me and making it possible to hold something while letting something else go. The 5 years of Aperture West became this kind of incredible period where I got to travel with amazing photographers. Mary Ellen was one of them. This card is, I still have it. It still sits next to my desk. I think I bought it from the Seattle Art Museum. I'm not entirely sure. It was the first time I saw myself or likeness in an art museum. I think the Hallmark collection was touring around this time. I think that's why this card was at the Seattle Art Museum. But it was something that I just had this visceral feeling of like, I think she might be lonely here. She should come home with me. And this card was in my dorm room. It's been in every apartment I've ever lived in. I got to know Mary Ellen not knowing that this was a photograph she had made for like the first 5 years that I knew her. And then I was suddenly like, oh, Indian Circus, oh, that's you. And those ways of being able to connect with photographers as humans became so important, and allowing that they were people and there was work and there was a connection between the people and the work. But sometimes the work got to then go out into the world and live on its own. And that was such an incredible experience as someone who was often working with the work, but then had this opportunity of getting to know the people. While I was doing most of the travel for Aperture West, I was also teaching graphic design at Seattle Central Community College and designing a few books freelance. And this photograph for me was one that was a very important moment of understanding. When I got back to the West Coast, Steve Barron, who loved Bob Adams, said, you should call him and see if he'll do a lecture. And so I called him, and he very politely declined. But he said, if you want to talk through things, I'm happy to talk through things whenever that's useful. And so we were doing a fundraiser specific to Aperture West, and I asked if he would donate one of these photographs, which he very kindly did. And as I was unwrapping it, I was saying to a colleague of mine in Seattle, I don't get Robert Adams' work. I have no idea why Aperture has published, I don't know, Leslie, 8 books at that point, maybe. I don't get it. I know it's really, you're not supposed to say that out loud. But I really didn't get it. I was like, this is boring, and I just can't come up with anything else. And so as I'm unwrapping this print and saying this to my colleague, I'm looking at the print. And I'm like, except that choosing to crop this tree right at this specific location kind of leaves you feeling like you're hanging on the edge, and there's something kind of cool about that. And then my eye moves down to the lower right-hand corner, and now there's dimensionality, which takes me back to this horizon, and oh, wait, there's a little movement or incline in the horizon. And it was like a religious conversion. And then I had to pull out all 8 of those books and look at everything all over again. And for me, again, coming back to the object, the relationship of the print. And I can't remember if I said this, I think maybe I skipped this part, but all of the images that are in the book are photographs that I live with. Many of them were given to me as a thank you from projects we did together. Some of them I purchased. This was one of them. I bought this at an Aperture benefit. The majority of the images that I purchased have come from nonprofit organizations or in support of nonprofit organizations. But this is a photograph that continues to remind me to slow down and take time to see what is present and be uncomfortable and get to know what's happening. And it's not always going to reveal itself the first time. It might reveal itself the 10th time. It might take a couple years. And then when that happens, I have to go back and look at all of this other work over again that I also didn't understand. But that is part of the joy of seeing and continuing to bring ourselves to the work. Remembering that there's no period of time when it's enough. None of us are ever going to know enough that we just don't have to learn anymore, right? And I think if there's anything that I can share with you, those of you who are photographers, those of us who are not photographers, we are still working too. We are still learning. We fall into trends and patterns just like you do. We find comfort zones and we want to stay there because it's nice when you're comfortable. This one is not so comfortable. This photograph sits above my desk. When I teach visual literacy, this is almost always included in the image selection. This is a photograph from one of the last books I designed for Aperture called American Cockroach from 2004. Catherine is a California born and raised artist. She's now based in New York, splits her time between Sun Valley and New York. And this was, again, a period of time of being introduced to work that was constructed in nature, thinking about the environment, conquering fear, and moving beyond something that provoked such a strong visceral reaction in me that I had to then take a step back, take a step forward. And in full transparency, I'm not scared of cockroaches, but I'm terrified of mice. And Catherine raises mice in her studio as part of her photographic practice. So the first time I went to meet with her, it is that clash between the personal and the professional. Like, I have to stand in your studio and try not to vomit. And I'm not sure if I can do that. But that is also what continues to take me back to photography. And sometimes the work that challenges me the most is work that I learned from. And I learned to see new elements in it. This piece by Anne Millet is really here for and because of my mother. My mother and I have a very complicated relationship. She loves me very much, and she has not understood me ever. And I don't know An Mi very well. Most of the images that are in the book are by people that I've known for many years. We were supposed to travel together for the Aperture West lecture series, and she did the lecture in LA. I was on my way to pick her up to go to the airport to go to San Francisco, and I fell and dislocated my ankle and broke my leg in 3 places. And it was on the day of what would have been my father's 80th birthday. And I knew that he was like, slow down, you're doing too much, too fast. And it was a really intense period of having to learn how to walk again and understand that actually the world can function without you, which I didn't really want to acknowledge. So I didn't get to travel with An Mi, although she did the rest of the lecture series. Her mother brought me sushi in the hospital, so it all worked out very nicely. This photograph, which is from a book called Small Wars that Aperture published, this is a part of the Aperture limited edition print program. I bought it many years later and was thrilled it was still available. When I went to Burma for the first time in 2017, I saw a landscape around Mandalay. It's a semi-arid climate there. And I just had a flash of this photograph and looked up where it was made and where An Mi grew up, and looking at the difference and the similarities between where Mandalay is and parts of Vietnam. They're basically latitudinally very similar. An Mi's family escaping the Tet Offensive, my mother's family escaping the Japanese air raids of World War II, and just this repetition of trauma and memory and trauma and memory and resilience and survival. And so when I came back from Burma, I just knew I had to have this photograph. I needed to be able to return to the realities of that landscape, of those experiences, of someone like An Mi who can talk about her personal life experiences in a way that my mother can't and never will. And so it was a way, again, through photography of accessing part of my understanding of my own histories in a way that I would not have otherwise had access to. 2007-ish, I was called back into the office in New York. I was struggling in my marriage. I was not sure what forward motion was, and had helped Sylvia Plahy with a contract, and she said, what print would you like in trade? And I said, the one of the goose. She's like, goose? What are you talking about? I'm like, it's a goose. It's running after these dudes who are ignoring it. One of those guys is my career, the other one's my marriage. I'm the goose. And she paused for a moment, and then this huge smile came across her face, and she said, Michelle, that's not a goose. It's a swan out of water. You're gonna find your way back to the water. And I lived with this photograph during a transitional time, that 2007 to 2008. I took it to San Francisco, where I went next when I took a position with Chronicle Books, because I did not get the position I was hoping to get at Aperture. And this made me laugh. It made me cry. It gave me hope. It filled me with despair. It did all of those things that life does, embodied in a single frame. And so a couple of years later, and I'll show you the photograph that she made in between, but a couple of years later, well, 7 years later, I was in a very different place in life, and she sent me an envelope with no words, just it was addressed to me, and it was full of white feathers. And she had just come back from Prague, where she made this photograph many years earlier. And I knew exactly what she was saying. She was like, you're back in the water, it's okay. You and the swan, you made it. So 2010, 2012, period of time, a lot of shifts. Rise of social media, print-on-demand technology had kind of stabilized to a point that it was being used regularly. We'd gone through this little recession-y thing that made life very difficult. And people were trying to figure out how to make books in different ways. People were trying to figure out how to make publishing sustainable. How do we stay in business? Photographers still wanted beautifully created objects. Publishers were tired of losing money. And those of us who were in the middle were in the middle. And we're trying to figure things out. So this is a photograph by Lisa Cressy, who we were at Bard together. We both worked in the publications office. This is from a series she did called Joe's Junkyard. The book was published by Damiani in 2012. And this was a case where she had presented this project to publishers. I'd presented it to publishers. No one wanted to do it. And in 2008, we were like, well, maybe we should just do it. Let's just try and, I will trade you my design knowledge for a couple of prints, and we will edit and design the book together. And that's what we did. And Damiani had published other books of hers, and once we had done the work, agreed to publish the book. I love this photograph of her father. There's something just incredible and solid about it. And again, it is something that I like to use when I'm teaching visual literacy, because people read a lot of things into this, particularly if they don't know anything about Lisa, or if they don't like junkyards. But since I grew up with a bunch of old cars, which I'm sorry, Larry, I didn't put the Studebaker in here, but I too grew up with a 59 Caddy, and it meant a lot to me, but not as much as my 1950 Studebaker. So I spent a lot of time on junkyards with my father, and so there's something very resonant for me about this image, which came in trade when we were working on her book. I spent from 2008 to 2010 at Chronicle Books in San Francisco, where hands down the most important photographer in my life at that point was Jim Marshall. Nobody told me to fuck off more than Jim did. And nobody told me that he loved me more than Jim did either. And he was the first time that I recognized, when I met him, I'm like, oh, you are Michael Hoffman and Mary Ellen Mark and my mother and a few other complicated figures in my life. I don't have to be friends with you. I don't have to work with you. I can choose to not engage with this insanity. Of course, I didn't do that. But I did recognize, and Jim was really probably one of the last people that I made that kind of space for. We worked together on a book called Pocket Cash of his photographs of Johnny Cash, and then he died very suddenly in 2010, and I had the opportunity to work with his estate for a couple of years to sort of develop what would become Jim Marshall photography. And so this period of working at Chronicle was very important, because I was learning how to make books when the people who were making the books wanted to make money from them. And that was new. And so it was very important to gain that business knowledge. I went from being a designer to being an editor. I was working beyond simply photography, but also engaged with other contemporary art forms. And yet my heart was still certainly within photography. I was very quietly also still working for Aperture Magazine, because I have an addictive personality and I have a very tough time letting go of anything. And so this was a really important period of learning about the business of publishing at greater scale. And that was very important to what would eventually become the founding of Minor Matters. Not unlike 2001, 2011 to 2012 was a pretty major period of change. In 2011, I was laid off from Aperture. I was there in total 15 years, and that was the longest relationship of any in my life. The same year, my husband decided that he no longer wanted to be married. So it was a big change. And this is a photograph by a student of mine at the time, Charlie Rubin. So I was invited to teach this class about Aperture at Aperture, and I got laid off the week of the first class. So I spent 14 weeks with students from Parsons teaching them about the organization that I no longer worked for. And I didn't tell them, because I just couldn't. It was my own denial. I didn't tell them till the last class that actually I had been teaching them this entire thing and didn't work for Aperture anymore. But it was actually very therapeutic, and I'm running out of time, so I gotta move forward. But this photograph for me, Charlie included this in his thesis work, and I'd seen the image many times, and then I went to see his thesis show, and he bent the print. And I was both horrified and delighted. He bent it along this rock, the kind of big major rock piece. And I realized that he'd done something that to me was so sacrilegious, and yet took something flat and made it sculptural. And that was another reminder of, it's my job to keep up with how you think, not the other way around, right? If I'm going to stay engaged in the continuance of photography, I'm responsible for getting a handle on why it is you're doing what you're doing. I don't have to like it. I don't have to like it. But I have to understand it and at least try to move into a space of your thinking. And so that was an important transition moment. This is the portrait that Sylvia made of me to show me what I look like as a swan. This was made at the end of 2012. I was not feeling swan-like at all. And she had seen another photograph, which is in the book, that is a hard picture of me that was made by my friend Adrienne Chester, and is how I felt at the time. It shows me, to myself, it shows me broken. And she said, that's a very powerful image, but I don't see you that way. So I'm gonna give you another visual. And I want you to know that this is how I see you. And so, again, the power of photography and portraiture, the ways that it can transform us. And the year of 2012 was really where I began formalizing what would become Minor Matters. I'd had this idea with all these people trying to publish without really knowing anything about publishing. And I was like, well, I actually know something about publishing. How can I apply that knowledge to see if we can solve some of these challenges? So I was looking at the business and looking at the parts of bookmaking that I cared about, which was beautiful, beautiful books, and trying to figure out how to make the financials work. For those of you who subscribe to Aperture, the early issues of the magazine, 1 of every 4 issues would list the subscribers in the back of the book. And I loved the artifact of that. I loved seeing Irving Berlin's subscribed to Aperture, Douglas Fairbanks Jr. subscribed to Aperture. It was just this snapshot of a moment in time. And so I started thinking about, okay, well, what if we sold books to people, but we just sold them at a different part of the publishing process? What if we sold them before we printed it instead of after we printed it? And that way we would know if anyone other than us thought that this book should exist. And so the model for Minor Matters is this. We develop projects with our visual authors. We conceive of whatever the physicality of the book will be, the concept, potential writers. All of the books have a retail of $50. So there is formula to the math. There's not formula to the making. The book has to be a book we can make for $50. And then we launch it on our website. And there is a 3-month pre-sales process. And if 400 to 500 people buy the book, we make the book. And if they don't buy the book, we don't make the book. So this was being conceived in 2012. And I realized in my first kind of wave through it that I knew what I needed to know about publishing. I hit a pause point in it's going to cost me $25,000 to build a website and all of the other stuff that goes with launching a business. I don't have that. I don't want to go out and raise it. And then I was talking to a former student of mine who's a web and app developer and realized that this was going to be an e-commerce business as much as it was going to be a publishing business. Sales needed to transact online, and I didn't know how to do that, and we might have to refund 399 orders, and I definitely didn't know how to do that. And so I went to him and said, hey, new idea. How about you be my business partner? And you do all that stuff I don't know how to do. And thankfully, because he was tired of working entirely on screens, he said yes. So we launched Minor Matters in 2013 with 5 titles. And of the first 5 books we launched, we produced the first 3. And when Minor Matters launched in 2013, I had no full-time job. I had no other form of income. And I was ready to just leap off a cliff and try to figure it out. And then I was offered a job as executive director of Photographic Center Northwest in Seattle, where I had applied 2 previous times and not been hired. And everyone around me said, take the job, Michelle. Take the job, take the job, take the job. And I did, because I was scared. I learned a great deal from running that organization for 7 years. I also learned that while I knew a lot of men who did multiple things, Leon Botstein, the president of Bard College, is also a conductor. Michael Hoffman was a curator at Philadelphia the entirety of the time he ran Aperture. Graham Nash is a musician and also a photographer. Nobody tells those guys, like, I don't think you can do all this. A lot of people told me what I couldn't do. And I decided to ignore them. Because really I'd lost all my filters at that point. I'd lost most of my fear. I'd lost everything, so it kind of didn't matter. You know, it's like, well, how bad, how much worse can it get? It cannot get worse. So there's actually a kind of freedom that comes from that. So I ran PCNW for 7 years while we were building Minor Matters. Alice Wheeler is an artist who used the darkrooms, the color darkrooms, when we still had them at PCNW, a book that I had longed to make for many years. Very happy that we published Outcast and Innocence in 2015. This is the work of Marina Font, who we published in 2018. I'm kind of skipping together because I'm realizing I'm way over time. Isaac Lehman, who is a Seattle-based artist. This is a unique object that, not unlike Amanda's work and some of the others who are here, this is a dynamic piece that changes over time. It was incredible to be building 2 organizations. I liked working back and forth between them. If you really want to know why I'm no longer at PCNW, you can read that in the book. I also started 10 years ago from an old issue of Aperture, 1957 issue, diving into how we see. And there is a workbook that is included in the copies that are for sale at Medium. Not everyone gets one of these, but the co-publishers did. So there is a workbook that walks through the kind of basics of the importance of our brains and the subjectivities that our personal experiences bring to what we see. So I sort of took their many and varied ways of thinking about seeing and broke them down to really 4 elements. 1, rooting yourself in what informs your thought process, your seeing, which might be your age, it might be your height, it might be your gender, it might be your spiritual upbringing, it might be that you didn't have enough coffee this morning. The importance of experiencing. So anyone who reviewed with me will know that I said to you, I try to look at every image twice, because the first time I just kind of need to take it in, and then we can talk about it. The facts of the photograph are actually trying to reshape the neural functions of our brains, stopping the natural storytelling process of your brain and focusing just on what you see. It's very difficult. Within 90 seconds, anytime I've done this exercise, within 90 seconds, somebody says something is in the frame that isn't there. Okay? That's how our brains work. We are storytelling creatures. And yet, when we look at ways that we would like to see improvement in the culture of America today, to me, this is our sticking point. Because our memories are here, the abstraction of language is here, and so we can talk about how we want the world to be different, But if we don't disrupt what's informing from our own subjective experiences, we're not going to see that change. So, photograph. If we had time, I would walk you through this. I'm not going to. This is the last photograph in the plate in the book by India Beale, who we published in 2020. Such an important person and project for me to enter the pandemic with. And if you don't know this work, this is from a series called Am I What You're Looking For? I have a copy of Performance Reviews somewhere around here if you want to take a look at it. These, last but not least, are a selection of the titles that we've successfully published through Minor Matters. We've done, 26 books to date. The last 3 that you see are books that we launched the end of March into the pre-sales process. The top one, Rachel Demi's book, achieved its goal in a day, which had never happened, so that was exciting. Anu Matthews, The Answers Take Time, and Sant Khalsa's Crystal Clear Western Waters, these are both in pre-sales. So if you really want to understand the process, feel free to purchase one of those books and hopefully see your name in the end result as we are working our way toward those goals. Thank you. Oh, questions. I know you're all exhausted and just want to leave, and we can have questions upstairs, but if anyone wants to ask questions now, I'm super happy to do that. And I will repeat the questions, because Scott told me to, and I try to do what Scott tells me to do. Scott. Oh, God, too. I always do what God tells me to do, and goddesses. Does anyone have questions? Comments? Thoughts? Yes.
Being a big fan of Minor White forever, having gone to RIT where you taught, all that, and then you bring, I had no idea, when I first met with you here, and then the Minor, there's this full circle thing going on with me with the Minor White. And now you name it Minor Matters. How did you end up with that name?
That's a great question. I started with a very different name, and no one could pronounce it. So I backed away from that. And Minor Matters came out of a couple of things. It came out of certainly the inspiration of Minor White, who remains a deep inspiration for me as a writer, as a sequencer, as a photographer, as a teacher. But it was also an understanding of the fact that people don't really think of me as a minority, because in photography, people just think of me as like the person I am in photography. And drawing out perspectives that are lesser seen was important to me, particularly at that period of time of recognizing, wow, I keep hitting these ceilings. And one of the complexities sometimes when you're mixed is, I was raised by my Irish-American father, who told me regularly that I could be anything I wanted in the world, and I believed him. And so I moved through the world with a being of a middle-class white man, and that is not the body I walk through the world in. And so recognizing for myself, recognizing that I needed to take a step back and kind of look at the larger picture and be like, some things are happening and I don't always understand why they're happening or why this opportunity went away or this one came up, and trying to get a better handle on that, but then also looking around and saying, what can I be doing that is making all of what we're doing better? Whose voices are missing? And that started for me to some extent from a geographic standpoint. That, I was, Aperture West's territory was west of the Mississippi. I had to put up a map for the board members in New York to be like, see this 3/4 of the United States? That's the part we're trying to engage. And so, it's natural, right? We're drawn to likenesses. And so, I do think it's important that we acknowledge these things. They're uncomfortable conversations. They're not criticisms. They're conversations that need to be had. So when I started Minor Matters, I wasn't gonna step out into the world and be like, hey, I've discovered some new things that we need to pay more attention to. I wasn't ready. I don't know that I'm even ready now. Like, I'm standing in front of you saying this stuff, then I'll probably be terrified in an hour that I even said it. But I recognized that I needed to do something. And so in photography, no one saw minor as minority. Anyone who knew me was like, oh, minor white, that's cool. Minor white matters. Of course minor white matters. I went to the photographers to say, does this feel diminishing? That was my only fear. Because minor can be seen as unimportant, but minor can also be seen as a different key. Minor is about quantity, not value. There are fewer of these things. So can being minor be precious? Can having scarcity be like, oh, there's not very much of this? That makes it more valuable. So I was sort of playing with words, but also forming an identity for myself that I could step into after a long time of not necessarily wanting to or being willing to do that. Other questions? Thank you. Yes.
Sorry, this is an obvious question. We've had a wonderful opportunity to have talked before and have conversations before, Michelle. But with your will for both language and text and seeing an image, personally, what was most elemental to your seeing and your learning? Could you repeat the question?
Yes, thank you, sorry. Bailey asked, given my own affinity for language and image, for text and image, what was most elemental to my seeing?
To your seeing, right? To the access of seeing and also to learning, right?
To seeing and to learning. I would have to say, one, when I started at Aperture, I felt very uninformed. And I was sitting at the table with people who were like, oh yeah, remember when Harry Callahan did this? And oh yeah, Paul Strand likes that. And I was like, these names were humans to people. These names were not humans to me. These names were like icons and statues and books. These names were books. Robert Glenn Ketchum was the first person that I met who literally manifested from a typeface to me into a human being. It was very weird. And so I took a year taking books home from Aperture's library and just going through them and looking at everything, looking at the paper, looking at the design, looking at the photographs, reading the text, trying to understand, which is why I kept failing with Robert Adams. I did that for a year just to try and build awareness. And I think the fact that I hadn't studied photography and I hadn't actually formally studied design, I had a little bit of a chip of like, I'm not good enough, I'm not good enough, I'm not good enough, and therefore I have to just keep learning, which was a good chip in some ways. And then Peter Bradford, who was an amazing designer who designed some of did Salgado's cover and a number of the Strand books, very famous books, said to me like, what's up with the chip? Get over it. So what? Like, if you're doing this, do it and be good at it, but stop apologizing for what you think you don't know. Do the work. And so that was maybe 4 years in. And that was also good advice. That was also like, don't carry this insecurity because it's not useful anymore. It was useful for a little while. It's not useful anymore. And I still go back to the books. The only thing that I didn't think I could do on my own book was design it. Like, I'd laid out the images, but I was like, I can't do it. I don't know where the caption should go. I don't want to figure out where the caption should go. I'm tired. There's all these words. Where did all these words come from? And I was really like, I'm not gonna do this. And then I went to my library and I pulled out Jan Tischhold's book about book design. It was from the 1930s, I think. And I sat surrounded by all my friends in the books and was like, oh, it needs to be within the text block. Keep everything within the grid. Okay, And then I tried it, and I liked it, and then I was like, oh, I guess that problem's solved. I don't have to hire someone. So it's evolutionary, but definitely that early year, for sure, of diving into the books and getting to know them. And I still do that. I still do that when I'm unsure or when I start a new project. I always pull out the books. You've all been so, oh yes, did you have a question?
Well,
Oh, you promised me one.
I just wanted to ask how you find the folks that you're publishing now. Do you have your own aesthetic that you kind of work with? Or do they find you? Or do you do things like like portfolio reviews?
Yeah.
How do they come to you, and what?
That's a great question. And there are a variety of answers. So this first book up here, Lisa Leone's Here I Am, Bruce Davidson had recommended her to me a decade before we actually met. And so that was just yeah, these pictures are cool. No, I don't think the institution I'm currently with is necessarily gonna wanna do anything with them, but glad I saw them. Totally forgot about her. And then we had a phone conversation under a completely different auspice, and her voice sounded familiar, and it turns out she was like, wait, did Bruce Davidson connect us way back in the day? And from there it became a book. I do attend portfolio reviews. We are a small imprint. We do, at the most, we launch 5 to 7 books because we never know how many of them we're actually gonna produce. In the last 5 years, we've produced all the books we've launched, which is wonderful, except I didn't really anticipate that starting, so it's a lot. And I can't ever assume that that's gonna happen, so we don't launch a ton of books, but definitely portfolio reviews, recommendations from other authors that we've worked with, from other photographers. When I started, I had a very long list of people that I wanted to work with. LaToya Ruby Frazier was one of them, and my colleagues at Aperture did that book. Chris McCaw, where's Chris? Chris was one of them, and Candela did that book. And for me, that was important. Like, this isn't a competition, right? I just want to hold the books. I don't actually really care who makes them, as long as they're made well, and I get to own them eventually. So that process of continuing, and I say that to people, our model isn't right for everyone. It's a lot of work to sell 500 copies, as I learned when I did my own book. It's hard. And so it's not the right fit for everybody. We have seen now that we've been in business for 9 years that there's different ways of going about it. Some people are people that I've followed for a long time. I went to India Beale for 3 years saying, want to make a book? Want to make a book? Want to make a book? Jocelyn Lee I met at APAD. I met at a photo professional event. So it's all, Melody McDaniel's book came to us through Kat Jimenez, which she was at Lucy Foundation at the time. And we had talked, and she'd send me a few projects that I said, no, this is not right for us. And she would say, okay, why isn't it right for you? And we do, I will say this out loud, like we do pay attention to the work, the human, their geographies, their backgrounds, the craft. So I have a chart, right? And I have a list of men, white men of a certain age, that when I have 3 other projects, then I call one of those guys up. But I am intentional in the list that we're building. And I want there to be balance. So, we're doing a season right now that is 3 women. The next season's probably gonna have 2 men. It's just, I do pay attention to that. That's important to me. I'm particularly excited because Rachel's book is definitely happening, but if these 2 books happen, we're gonna be 50-50 for the number of men and women that we've published in our entire list. And to me, that's really exciting. Thank you. So, so it's about the work, it's about the people, it is staying true to what we are trying to do, which is bring forth some voices that may not otherwise be seen. Sometimes that's about age. Sant is 69, right? She no longer has a gallery representing her. She's been teaching she taught at UC San Bernardino for 30 years. And so also looking at who are the people who actually need some champions behind them? And what can we do to draw attention to those projects? I mean, everyone needs a champion behind them, to be clear. But where we can kind of say, okay, you know, we're gonna try. And it's very much a joint effort. I mean, the photographers have to be involved in the process with us, and they have to want to work with us. I am very involved in the editorial and design of the project, and I work closely with people. Eric Johnson's book, Pine, is a great example of, he had really conceived the entire book. We made 2 very small changes, but one of the changes was the title. So it's like that. It's not, you know, we don't need to start from scratch if somebody has a concept that's working well, but we do ask that people be collaborative in that process. And because I'm obsessive about the physicality of the book itself, I go on press with many of them. I'm engaged in that process, and we want the books to live in the world. They are the histories of the future. And so as we look for projects, we're looking for things that are of this time, so that when we look back, when anyone looks back on us, God help us, when anyone looks back on this time, these are some of the reflections of what our culture and community were about. I am so happy to answer questions in the sunshine, by the pool, upstairs, wherever you want to be. Thank you so much.